Joining me now via Zoom to look at this development and, of course, some macroeconomic issues is a partner and chief economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Dr. Andrew Nevin. Dr. Nevin, good afternoon and thank you for your time.
Good afternoon.
Yes, the focus on infrastructure seems to be something that many will say is commendable. What's your reaction first to this move regards to the Second Niger Bridge?
Well, I think that the Second Niger Bridge is really, sorry, I have a little trouble with my position of the photo, but I mean, it is a game changer on that in terms of commercial activity and making people's lives easier. And I think that to the credit of His Excellency President Buhari's regime, they've stayed focused on trying to finish up a few key projects on that. And I think that the Honourable Minister there, I think her words were very accurate in terms of how to do this, and in terms of its contribution to the economy of the country. And so I think we're on the right track with the Second Niger Bridge. But I mean, obviously there are other keystone or foundational infrastructure projects around the country that also need to be completed.
I'm also interested in the Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund, and this is actually focused on bridging the same infrastructure gap. But I was wondering, what's the difference between this and Infraco?
Well, I mean, Infraco, as far as I understood, there's a number of different Infracos that are being put together, and that they can, it's not just the federal government that's going to be able to execute the projects that we need. They'll execute the foundational ones, but the Infracos are meant to be kind of profit-making institutions that invest in other sorts of infrastructure where you can recover the cost from it through the tariffs on the users on that. So I don't think there's any duplication of this. I think we have such a massive infrastructure gap. You're going to need multiple groups, and multiple groups that are able to finance infrastructure. But I mean, there are flagship projects like the Niger Bridge, Second Niger Bridge, that only the federal government can take on.
I'm also looking at the functions now of the NSIA, that's the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, which seems to be getting the positives from all of this investment this time.
Well, I think the NSIA is, again, is another example of a kind of well-constructed group that's been put together over the last decade. I mean, we've had ANCON, which of course is coming into its sunset. We've had the Development Bank of Nigeria. Now we have the NSIA that's really starting to function. I think the challenge for the NSIA, of course, is that we don't have a lot of funds in the sovereign investment fund, of course, and we've had to tap other sources. So if you compared it to, say, Abu Dhabi or Norway, they literally have hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars of funds to be able to do what they want. That's not the case in Nigeria. We all know how small the funds are, the NSIA. What the NSIA is, I think, very good about doing is being able to leverage other people's funds into these projects in Nigeria. And they're going to continue to have to do that because obviously we're not looking at a situation where we have hundreds of billions of dollars in the NSIA. So they're going to have to be more creative about the way they tap into resources.
Before we move on, I also like to now look at the benefits, looking at identifying them, basically how this will help enhance economic growth between all of these states. Anambra, yes, the Aba place where there's a lot of manufacturing going on. Do you see this as really changing the narrative of what we used to have along that axis before now, Dr. Nevin?
Well, absolutely. But I mean, just as a general point, I mean, people complain about the rapid inflation we have in Nigeria, and it is a real issue for the entire country at every economic level, particularly the bottom of the pyramid. But why do we have this rapid inflation? One of the major reasons we have it is because the infrastructure is not working. So then it gets expensive to move goods. Those expenses need to be recovered by the price increases that we have. So having a good infrastructure just brings your cost down. And if I had to kind of give a comparison with another country that's relatively like Nigeria, I would give India, where over the past 2 decades they've invested a lot in the physical infrastructure, the road infrastructure, the rail infrastructure, the port infrastructure, and you see the cost of basic goods, the cost of food, the cost of manufactured goods is lower because even getting it to the market, getting to the people that demand these goods is much lower. So if we're really going to bring down prices and make things affordable, we need to reduce the cost of moving things around, and the infrastructure is a critical part of that. So then the Second Niger Bridge in particular, I mean, very active commercial area in Nigeria, relatively wealthy part of the country. It cuts, if I understand, hundreds of miles off being able to cross the river, or the alternative is to go by boat, which adds extra expense. So it really is a game changer in that sense. But of course, we need not just the Second Niger Bridge, but we also need robust roads around the country. We need inland ports around the country, and all of this will contribute to eventually, I hope, getting to price levels that are more in line with what we see in India than what we have in Nigeria today.
Finally, on this part, let's look at public-private partnership here, because we talk many times that government cannot fund infrastructure development alone, and there must be support from the private guys. Look at what is happening on Apapa Oshodi Expressway when some private companies took over repairs of all of those roads. So what more can be done to encourage public-private partnership where everyone takes charge, everyone tries to fulfill his or her obligations?
Well, I think there are some cases where we don't want the PPP concept. I'm not a universal fan in favor of it. Oftentimes we have a situation where the public pays for it and the private sector benefits, and we don't want to have that kind of situation. So we need to make sure it's the right sort of circumstances. And so, for example, if I take the refineries that the country has, the 3 refineries, to me, those should be in private hands. If you look around the world, there's really not much benefit to trying to have state ownership or partial ownership of the state in the private sector and something like that. That can be fully in private hands and will work fine. So then when do you need a PPP? You need a PPP when the private capital can't really come in a way that isn't quite attractive to private capital, but there are lots of benefits that the private capital isn't going to necessarily capture, but the country captures in that, whether it's employment, whether it's an increased incomes for the bottom of the pyramid in that. And those are particularly around this road physical infrastructure. So if you take the Second Niger Bridge, I mean, there's no way you could, from tolls, be able to recoup all of the benefits that are going. And you don't want to. You want the benefits to be widespread on that. So I think in select projects, you want to have a public-private partnership. But what you also want to be careful about is the government underwriting the risk in the project, right? So one of the things that's happened with these PPPs, oftentimes the private sector demands that the government gives them a sovereign guarantee. And that's a very large, expensive give for the government. And if it's truly an economic project, I think that the private sector should also be bearing some risk. So you could have some risk sharing, and there's more and more ways to do that as they develop these instruments for that. And I think that's a good thing. So I'm in favor of the PPPs in select areas where you won't get the private capital fully committed to doing the project. But I still think when we do these PPPs, they have to be structured that the private sector is also bearing some risk, and you're not just transferring all the risk to the sovereign, because all you're doing then is saying that if the project goes badly, the people lose, and the project goes well, the private sector benefits. And I don't think that's a fair equation for the nation. So I think selective cases we should be using PPPs, but let's not see it as a cure-all for every type of investment that needs to be made in this country.
Great stuff. Let's now look at central banks' efforts aimed at reversing Nigeria's overdependence on imports, which is something that is very worrisome. What do you think about all of the efforts being made by the Apex Bank to change this narrative?
Well, I think we're on a path. I mean, we're one of the groups at PwC that would like to see a unified exchange rate. We were kind of on that path. ERGP said that we were going to have market-determined exchange rates. The finance minister said it, but we got knocked off with COVID, and we've actually seen the parallel rate widen. So we all know it's a difficulty. I mean, in terms of import substitution, I think from our viewpoint, there's sometimes people focus a bit too much on manufactured goods. We think there's really 3 areas that are obvious for the country. I mean, the first one, which everyone understands, is agriculture. Not only should we be exporting the 5 big crops, and we should be reducing our inputs of food. There's no reason this country should not be self-sufficient in food for all the reasons we understand. I now live in Abuja. I moved from Lagos, and it's incredible the products, the agricultural products that can be produced in this region that can feed the entire nation. But again, this is an infrastructure issue. Why is food so expensive in Lagos? Because the infrastructure to move food from the food-producing belts to Lagos is too expensive on that. So if we get some infrastructure and all the other parts that go in the agricultural value chain, so particularly around storage and processing in Nigeria, we'll be able to reduce the food imports. The second two, I think that people don't think about enough, though, are education and health. So there's a massive import of education. So, for example, if someone goes to university in the UK, paid for by their Nigerian parents, that is effectively an import of education on there. Similarly, if you go for your medical tourism to India to be treated there, that is an import of healthcare. And those two things, education and healthcare, I think by our estimates, just rough estimates, I'm not sure we have too many facts because a lot of it's invisible, but probably $3 to $4 billion a year. So we would like to see more efforts so that people would take their education and have their healthcare in Nigeria rather than seeking these exports. I mean, we used to have, I'm told, prior to, when I came 13 years ago, we had world-class universities, and of course now the education system really suffered. So if I had to take the three areas where I think the import substitution focus should be for the federal government, it would be in agriculture and food, it would be in education, it would be in healthcare. And I think if you made progress in those three, it would really make a difference in the balance of payments. I think it's a harder thing to displace some types of manufacturing. I don't think we're going to produce our own cell phones. I don't think we're going to produce our own generators. I don't think we're going to produce our own table fans, our own refrigerators anytime soon. So I think agriculture, healthcare, and education is where we should focus for the import substitution thesis.
So wrapping up now, I'm still worried about some challenges we face. Look at the issue of the e-invoicing, e-valuation thing. Look at what we grapple also with around the FX market. And of course, all other issues we are targeting with production too. We are giving ourselves 2 years to meet sufficiency of width. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think the e-invoice is a difficult one. I mean, the intent of the central bank was to make sure people weren't cheating the system by sourcing Forex and then, in fact, overpaying for something that they were importing and then kind of receiving that in the back end outside the country. So I understand the intent of the central bank. But it's a difficult thing to kind of make work in practice. And of course, the legislature came back and pushed against it. It's been delayed for the present time. I mean, the central bank has come out and said, they see a future where people will have to source their own FX. I mean, it's not a typical situation around the world where the central bank is responsible for giving you the Forex. And then we've entered into that situation because, of course, we always thought the only Forex was available through the oil proceeds, the NNPC, the Federation account. I mean, but now we have oil at $108 a barrel today, and yet we're not seeing any FX, right? Because the production of oil has really collapsed, the onshore oil. So it sort of highlights the central bank has said exactly the truth is you're going to have to source your own FX in the future. So, what can we export in this country on that? I mean, we've advocated high value-added services. So this is things like coding for employment, business processing, outsourcing, agriculture. I mean, it's not just the import substitution, but we have the 5 big crops for export there: cassava, sesame, cocoa, palm oil, and I always forget on there. Can't name all 5. On that, and as I said, the import substitution of education and healthcare on that. But people are going to have to get their own FX. And of course, the diaspora plays a big role in this. We put out the paper a few years ago that pointed out how big the diaspora flows were there. So this dollar gap or FX gap is solvable. But it's only solvable if we focus on the things we're saying: the services export, the agricultural export, and the import substitution of education and healthcare. Now, one of the big problems, though, unfortunately, is because there's a continuous depreciation of the naira. We have another effect, which is people want to accumulate assets in dollars. So we have not just the normal trade in goods, import-export of goods, affecting the naira value. But now people don't want to hold the naira because it'll be in self-fulfilling prophecy. Because it will depreciate, they then try to turn the naira into dollar assets. And we have lots of companies like Cowrie, For example, I think Cowrie-Wise is one, piggy invest that will help you invest in dollars. Unfortunately, that creates further pressure on the Naira. So it's very important that we improve our balance of payments so the Naira stabilizes and gives people less incentive to want to invest outside of the country, because that's an extra drag on our exchange rate at the moment. But I think we're heading in the right direction. I mean, just the recognition that you're not going to, in the future, whether it's 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, you're not going to source your FX from the CBN. I think it's really made people start to think a lot about these issues. I know that there's a lot of thought at the government level, a lot of private actors on the export of these big 5 agricultural crops on that. Microsoft just announced 1,000 seats in Lagos, which is an export of our young people's brains, high value-added services sitting in Lagos. We continue to have music. We continue to have Nollywood being exported. We're exporting financial services. You have banks marching across the continent like Access Bank and UBA. So we're getting there, but it is urgent that we have greater exports and then give more confidence in the Naira. I mean, if the Naira actually started to appreciate, so you went from 584, as you said today, to 525 to 475, people would want to keep the Naira, and that would accelerate the appreciation of the Naira. So we've just got to get out of this negative feedback loop where, because the Naira depreciates, people want to get their investments out of the country on that. Once we stop that, we'll be heading in a better direction.
I must thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist and Partner, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. We appreciate this.
Thank you, Tony. It's always a great pleasure to be with you.